The Texas air was an oven, blowing dust and the dry scent of dead grass. Captain Carter Hollister, a man whose loyalty shifted with the wind's direction and the weight of gold, dismounted with the arrogance of one who felt he owned the ground beneath his feet, even if it wasn't his. His dragoons, their blue uniforms already faded by the merciless sun, formed an intimidating semicircle before Silas Bailey's modest farmhouse. The metallic clink of Hollister's spurs on the packed earth was the only sound besides the wind whistling through the roof eaves. Silas stood on the porch, barefoot, his calloused hands hanging limply at his sides. He wasn't a man of imposing stature nor defiant gaze, but there was a stillness about him, akin to the ancient oak trees dotting his land, a silent resilience forged by time and trial. "Bailey!" Hollister's voice cut through the silence, sharp and disdainful. "Santa Anna's government requires this property for the pacification effort. You have 1 hour to gather your belongings and your family. The land now belongs to the Republic." Silas didn't move. His eyes, a deep blue like the sky before a storm, fixed on the captain's. He saw not an officer, but a vulture in a uniform. Inside the house, his wife, Sarah McCoy, clutched their young son, her face pale with fear, peering through the crack in the door. Silas's heart pounded, but his face was a mask of calm. He knew violence would be the end of everything. Honor, however, demanded he stand his ground. "This land has an owner, Captain," Silas said, his voice low but firm, each word carrying the weight of generations. "His name is on this document." He turned, stepped inside for a moment, and returned with a piece of yellowed paper, carefully folded. It was a deed, issued years before, when Texas was still a dream in the minds of brave men. The edges were frayed, the ink faded, but the handwriting was legible. Hollister let out a short, cruel laugh. "A piece of paper? You think a scrap of old settler paper can halt progress? Texas has new laws. Laws I enforce." Silas extended the document. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sanctity of what he held. "This is no ordinary paper. It was granted to my father by a man of his word." Hollister snatched the document from Silas's hand with a rough gesture. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the lines with a mix of impatience and contempt. He saw the terms, the land demarcation, the seal of the old Austin colony, and at the end, a signature. A signature he didn't bother to decipher, deeming it just another forgotten bureaucrat's name. To him, it was a symbol of the old order, a useless relic of a rebellious time. With a sneer, he crumpled the paper into a tight ball and tossed it onto the dusty ground right at Silas's feet. "There's the value of your document, farmer. It's trash, just like your loyalty to a Texas that no longer exists." The sound of the paper being crumpled echoed in Silas's heart, louder than a cannon blast. In an instant, he saw his father's face years ago, handing him that very document. It was a cold night, and the campfire crackled in their camp. His father, a man hardened by battles, had tears in his eyes. "This paper, son," he had said, "is more than land. It's a promise. It was signed by a man who looked death in the eye at the Alamo and didn't flinch. His name is Crockett. As long as you have this paper, you have his honor guarding your family." Silas knelt, slowly, his dignity intact, and picked the crumpled ball of paper from the ground. He didn't look at Hollister. He looked at the land, at the distant horizon where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and purple. He smelled his home, the scent of burning wood, of the bread Sarah baked. He felt the weight of his son in his mother's arms. All of it was contained in that crumpled paper. Hollister, pleased with the humiliation he had inflicted, mounted his horse. 1 hour, Bailey. Don't make me come back." The dragoons turned and rode away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a heavy silence, broken only by Sarah's stifled cry. Silas remained kneeling for a long time, smoothing the paper with care, trying to undo the cruel creases. He had already seen signs of danger. Weeks before, he'd heard stories of other farmers being driven out, their land seized by officials on vague pretexts of national security. But he had held on to faith, faith in justice, faith in the decency of men. He had believed his isolation would protect him, that his family's history, rooted in this land, would be respected. He had been a fool. The loyalty he cherished was worthless currency to men like Hollister. As he rose, the setting sun cast his long shadow across the yard. The dust kicked up by the horses still hung in the air, and through it, Silas seemed to hear a distant sound, an echo in the hot desert wind. It wasn't a real sound, but a memory, a feeling, the sound of a fiddle, playing a wild, free melody, the laughter of a man telling tales of bear hunts in Tennessee. It was the whisper of a name Carter Hollister had discarded as trash, but which, for the men and women of that land, was still a call to arms, a promise that justice, even when crushed, never truly dies. The captain didn't know it, but by crumpling that paper, he hadn't destroyed a document. He had awakened a legend. The days that followed were a descent into a silent hell. Hollister kept his word. At dawn the next day, a small garrison of soldiers occupied the main house. Silas, Sarah, and little Jacob were confined to the barn, a space that reeked of moldy hay and animal despair. From there, they watched helplessly as strangers walked across their porch, used their furniture, and ate food from their pantry. The humiliation was a slow poison, administered in daily doses. The soldiers laughed loudly, drank the pulque they carried in leather canteens, and treated the property as war spoils. The Mexican flag, with its eagle and serpent, was hoisted on the pole where the lone star flag of Texas once fluttered. For Silas, every glance at that flag was like a nail driven into his soul. Injustice spread like a plague. Hollister, feeling untouchable, turned the Bailey farm into his personal headquarters. He imposed a protection tax on other ranchers in the area, a thinly veiled extortion. Those who refused to pay found their cattle vanishing overnight or their water wells contaminated. Fear paralyzed the community. Men who once greeted Silas with a nod now averted their eyes when they saw him in the village seeking supplies. He was no longer a neighbor. He was an outcast, an example of what happened to those who defied power. His honor, once his most precious possession, was now a stain. Hollister reveled in his impunity. On one particularly hot afternoon, he summoned Silas to the farmyard. The captain sat in a rocking chair that had belonged to Silas's father, drinking iced lemonade served by one of his men. "I heard you went to town to complain to the magistrate, Bailey," Hollister said with a lazy grin. "Tell me, how did that go? Was he sympathetic?" Silas remained silent, the sun beating on his back. The visit to the magistrate had been the worst humiliation. The man, a cowardly bureaucrat, hadn't even glanced at the papers Silas had spent nights smoothing and mending. He had simply shaken his head and mumbled something about hard times and the need to cooperate. "You see, farmer," Hollister continued, rising and walking over to Silas, "power isn't in old papers or forgotten laws. Power is here." He tapped his pistol holster. "It's in the willingness to use it. You and your rebel friends never understood that. You fight for ideas, for feelings. I fight for results. And the result is that this land is mine now." To prove his point, He ordered 2 of his men to tear down the old wooden corral that Silas's father had built with his own hands. The axe blows echoed through the valley, each strike a direct assault on Silas's heart. He closed his eyes, and the memory came, stronger and clearer than ever. He was a 10-year-old boy, small and thin, trying to help his father lift a heavy beam. He tripped and fell. A large man who was visiting the ranch caught him before he hit the ground. The man wore a coonskin hat and had the widest smile Silas had ever seen. "Careful there, little fella," the man boomed, his voice like friendly thunder. "This land don't like its children getting hurt." His father approached, smiling. "Silas, this is Mr. Crockett. He's come to help us mark the boundaries." Davy Crockett ruffled his hair and winked at him. "Your father's a good man, son. He's building more than a fence here. He's building a future. Remember that. The future belongs to those who build it with their own hands and defend it with their own hearts." The memory was so vivid, Silas could smell Crockett's pipe tobacco and feel the rough touch of his hand on his head. This wasn't just a memory of a chance encounter, it was the foundation of his identity. He wasn't just fighting for a piece of land, he was defending a promise made to his father, a promise contained in the gaze of that legendary man. To protect that land was to protect the very meaning of honor, of hard work, of a future built, not stolen. When the last planks of the corral came down, reduced to a pile of splinters and dust, something inside Silas shifted. The despair that consumed him began to recede, giving way to a chilling coldness, a clarity of purpose. He looked at Hollister, who stood smiling, pleased with the destruction. And for the first time, Silas didn't see an all-powerful devil. He saw only a man, an arrogant man, who based his power on the fear he inspired. And fear was a foundation of sand. Silas began to observe. He noticed the way Hollister's soldiers looked at each other, some with resentment at the captain's arrogance. He noticed the wagons that arrived and departed in the night, laden with crates that didn't seem to contain military supplies. He noticed that Hollister, despite all his bravado, was careless, overconfident in his own invincibility. Each humiliation, each broken plank, each pitying glance from his neighbors no longer broke him. It planted something new within him, something that grew stronger than fear. The captain saw a broken farmer. He didn't realize that in the quiet of the barn, amidst the scent of gunpowder and hay, Silas Bailey had stopped lamenting and started listening. The night became Silas's ally. While the ranch slept under the negligent watch of Hollister's soldiers, he acted. The first step was to restore the proof of his honor. With the patience of a craftsman, under the flickering light of an oil lamp in the barn, he used some flour paste Sarah had prepared to join the torn pieces of the document. Each fragment was a piece of a sacred puzzle. When he finished, the paper was mended, the scars of Hollister's contempt visible, but the integrity of the text, and more importantly, the signature at the end, was restored. D. Crockett. The name seemed to gleam under the dim light, an ember of hope in the darkness. But Silas knew the document by itself wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed a man who understood the language that name spoke. Under the cloak of a moonless night, he slipped out of the barn. He kissed Sarah and their sleeping son, a silent oath on his lips. He moved like a ghost across his own land, avoiding the sentries. His knowledge of the terrain, a weapon Hollister couldn't confiscate. He walked for hours, traversing hills and dry creek beds until he reached an isolated cabin nestled in a remote canyon. Smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney. Here lived Wyatt Holt, a man whom time had almost forgotten. Wyatt had been a Texas Ranger in his youth, one of the few who had ridden with Silas's father and known the heroes of the Revolution personally. Now he was an old man with a grizzled beard and eyes that held all the storms he had ever witnessed. Wyatt greeted him with the suspicion of a lone wolf. Sitting by the fire, he listened to Silas's story in silence, cleaning an old rifle with an oiled cloth. When Silas finished, the old man gritted his teeth. "The world's changed, boy," Wyatt said, his voice as rough as gravel. "The time for men like Crockett and your father is past. Now is the time for vultures like this. Hollister, fighting him is like punching the wind. It'll just tire you out." Silas felt a chill run down his spine. If Wyatt, the legendary Wyatt Holt, had lost hope, what chance did he have? But he hadn't come all this way to give up. With trembling hands, he withdrew the mended document from his inner shirt pocket and extended it to the old man. "I didn't come to ask you to fight, Mr. Holt. I came to ask you to read." Wyatt took the paper reluctantly. His eyes scanned the text, but it was when he reached the signature that his calloused hands stopped trembling. He traced the signature with his index finger, as if he could feel the presence of the man who had written it. The silence in the cabin grew dense, heavy. With memories, Wyatt looked up at Silas, and the apathy was gone. In its place was a spark, the same one that must have blazed when he was a young ranger facing the Comanches. "Davy," he whispered, "he signed this in front of me on the banks of the Brazos River. He told your father, an honest man's signature is worth more than all the gold in Mexico." The old man stood up, the stiffness in his bones forgotten. He was no longer looking at a desperate farmer, but at the guardian of an oath. "They aren't just stealing your land, son. They're spitting on the graves of good men. This can't stand." The alliance was sealed, not with a handshake, but with a shared understanding that some things were sacred. Wyatt still had contacts, old friends and debtors of favors scattered across the territory. Together, they began to draw up a plan, not of violence, but of intelligence. While Silas, during the day, played the role of the defeated farmer, enduring the soldiers' insults so as not to raise suspicion, Wyatt used the night to gather information. He discovered what Silas had already suspected. Hollister was using the confiscated farms as staging grounds for a lucrative arms and whiskey smuggling operation, selling to bands of renegades and hostile tribes, betraying not only the Texas settlers, but the very Mexican army he claimed to serve. The small victory came a week later. One of Wyatt's old contacts, a merchant whom Hollister had tried to extort, provided him with a copy of a ledger. It detailed the captain's illegal transactions, dates, quantities, names, and payments. It was irrefutable proof of his treason. The plan took shape. They wouldn't ambush Hollister on a dark road. They would expose him in broad daylight, using his own laws against him. Wyatt learned that General Antonio Canales, a loyal officer known for his hatred of corruption within his ranks, would be inspecting the region in a few days. The opportunity was perfect. Justice would come not from the barrel of a rifle, but from the tip of a pen, just like the original promise. On the morning the general's entourage was due to arrive in town, Hollister was preparing an honorable reception, with his men polishing buckles and brushing horses. Little did he know that the true guest of honor was not the general, but a humble farmer with a torn piece of paper in his pocket and the truth as his only weapon. San Felipe's main square buzzed with a contained tension. The midday sun beat down on the heads of Hollister's soldiers, lined up in impeccable formation to greet General Canales. Hollister himself was in his finest uniform, his chest puffed with pride and self-assurance, ready to present a picture of absolute order and control. He saw the general's visit as an opportunity to solidify his power, perhaps even for a promotion. General Canales arrived punctually, a middle-aged man with a stern face and an observant gaze. He dismounted, accepting Hollister's salute with a short, almost dismissive nod. It was then that the crowd of citizens, kept at bay by guards, parted. Silas Bailey walked to the center of the square. He was unarmed. He wore his usual simple clothes, stained with dust and sweat. Beside him walked Wyatt Holt, the old rifle resting on his shoulder, not as a threat, but as a symbol of bygone times. Wyatt's presence, a living legend to many, caused a murmur among the older soldiers. "What is the meaning of this?" Hollister growled, his face contorted with rage at the interruption. "Guards, arrest this man for insubordination." 2 soldiers advanced, but stopped when General Canales raised his hand. His eyes were fixed on Silas, intrigued by the farmer's quiet courage and the old ranger's presence. "Let the man speak," the general ordered, his voice calm but laced with authority. "If he has the courage to address me in public, I want to hear what he has to say." Silas took a step forward. He didn't look at Hollister. He addressed the general directly. "General Canales, my name is Silas Bailey. This officer, Captain Hollister, took my land in the name of the Republic. But it is not my land that I have come to speak of. I have come to speak of the honor of your army." Hollister laughed. "The ravings of a defeated rebel general? Don't waste your time." But Silas continued, his voice clear and firm. He didn't begin with the story of his farm. He began with betrayal. He pulled the ledger from his pocket and handed it to one of the general's aides. "This book, sir, details an operation of arms and whiskey smuggling, weapons that have been sold to outlaws who attack both settlers and your own patrols. The operation is led by Captain Hollister, using confiscated properties, like mine, as a base." General Canales' face darkened as his aide whispered the contents of the book to him. Corruption was the cancer he despised most. Hollister's smile faltered, the color draining from his face. He began to stammer, to deny, but the details in the ledger were too specific. "It's a fabrication, a forgery created by this traitor," Hollister shouted, desperation starting to show in his voice. It was then that Silas played his final card. He turned to Hollister. "You called me a liar and said my deed was trash. You crumpled it and threw it on the ground. But what you didn't realize, Captain, is the name signed on it." Silas withdrew the mended document and handed it to the general. Canales took it with care. He was a career soldier, a man who understood history and war. He knew his enemies, and in a strange code of military honor, he respected great warriors, even those on the opposing side. His eyes widened slightly as he saw the signature. "Crockett," he said, more to himself than to the others. He looked up at Hollister, and in his eyes was glacial contempt. It wasn't just for the corruption, but for the stupidity. "You held in your hands a document signed by one of the men who died at the Alamo," the general said, his voice cutting. "A piece of this land's history, and you treated it like trash? You are not just a thief, Captain. You are a fool. A man who does not recognize the value of honor, not even that of an honorable enemy, is not worthy of wearing this uniform." Hollister's humiliation was complete and public. Before his own men, the general, and all the citizens he had terrorized, his authority disintegrated. General Canales gave the order. "Sergeant, disarm this man. He is under arrest for treason, smuggling, and conduct unbecoming an officer." Hollister's own men, many of whom secretly despised him, carried out the order with almost cheerful efficiency. They ripped off his insignia, took his sword and pistol. Hollister's power, built with bayonets and fear, crumbled with the sound of a single sheet of paper. The general turned to Silas and returned the document to him. "The Republic has no interest in land obtained by dishonorable means, Mr. Bailey. Your property is yours." The people in the square did not applaud. In a gesture of deep respect, the men removed their hats to Silas. Justice had been served, not with blood and vengeance, but with courage and truth. That day, in the heart of Texas, everyone learned a powerful lesson. Honor would always outweigh steel. A year later, the Bailey farm flourished once more. The Texas flag fluttered proudly from the flagpole. With the help of neighbors whose respect Silas had tenfold regained, the corral was rebuilt, stronger than before. Peace had returned to the valley, not a peace imposed by fear, but a peace won by the courage of an ordinary man. Silas never considered himself a hero. He simply did what needed to be done to protect his family and the promise he had made to his father. He was a farmer, and his work was to cultivate, whether it was the land or justice. Carter Hollister was never seen in those parts again. The stories that trickled in were vague. Some said he rotted in a military prison in Mexico City. Others, that he was exiled to some forgotten post in the Sonora desert. His real fate didn't matter. What mattered was that he had become a memory, a cautionary tale about how arrogance can blind a man to the true nature of power. He tried to destroy Silas Bailey, but in the end, he destroyed himself. In Texas, true revenge is living free while your enemy is imprisoned by their own past. Wyatt Holt, on occasion, would ride over to the farm to share a coffee with Silas on the porch. They spoke little, but the friendship between them was deep, forged in the silent fire of loyalty. They would look at the horizon, at the land stretching as far as the eye could see, and know that the fight never truly ended. Freedom, like land, needed to be tended. Every day, inside the house, above the stone fireplace, was the document. Silas had framed it, the scars of the crumpled paper still visible like the wrinkles on a wise old man's face. He wanted his son, Jacob, to grow up looking at it, so he would understand that his family's history was written not just with ink, but with integrity. The paper itself held no magical power. Its power came from the honor of the man who signed it and the courage of the man who defended it. On that land, Silas Bailey's story became a legend, told around campfires and on front porches. The story of how a powerful officer scoffed at a piece of paper, not knowing he was scoffing at the very soul of Texas. The land was safe, not by the document, but by the promise it contained. A promise that, in this wild and beautiful land, a man of his word was worth more than an entire army. If this story of courage and honor moved you, and if you believe that the values of freedom and justice should be defended, subscribe to our channel. Share this video with everyone who is proud of their roots and knows that the true strength of a people comes from their character. And don't forget to comment from where you are watching, so we can know how far the spirit of Texas reaches.